Hello, I'm Mandi McLeod. Welcome to Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. Coming up in the show, New Zealand farmers get a reprieve from emissions trading. We discuss what this means for agriculture in New Zealand. The story of pork, what has to be changed to ensure there is a fairy tale ending for pork producers. The Irrigation Acceleration Fund opens for business with a fresh start for fresh water. We look at what this means for producers and exporters. Joining me today is Hayley Moynihan, Senior Analyst for Dairy and Animal Proteins with Rabobank, and Sam McIvor, CEO of NZ Pork. Welcome.
Thanks, Penny.
Sam, at your recent pork industry conference, there was a call from one of your speakers to change the story. Can you tell us a bit more about this and what the challenge to pork producers is going to be?
Yeah, the guy was Paul Patterson, who is the CEO of Rivoli in Australia, Australia's biggest pork producer. And really the challenge that Paul put in front of, I guess, industries is that we need to engage with the consumer more. And so that's about communicating with the consumer, but also listening and responding in the way that we farm and produce our products.
So I also saw in there that one of the comments he made was that despite wanting to communicate with consumers, that potentially consumers didn't really want to get to know the pig before it ended up as bacon, which is a little bit different, I guess, to the other red meats. Is that...
Yeah, it's a weird sort of challenge in a way, I think. You're right. The consumer does want to know, but they don't want to know. So I think where we're focusing on is really giving them the opportunity if they want to dig deeper. And that's things like building a pig farming website where they can go in and they can see exactly what's happening on every farm. Or the other example that we're using at the moment is we're writing a book for school kids, which is all about an introduction to pig farming, and that's about making them comfortable with what they're seeing, so that as they come to make decisions about the product, then they can do it with confidence and some knowledge. The other thing I guess we're doing in terms of responding to consumers is, we are phasing out the use of stalls. We've put the audit in place, independent audit for every farm in New Zealand, and then we're committing to research those emerging issues at the other end, like farrowing crates. So it is about consumers seeing that you're making tangible steps in response as well, I think.
And what response have you seen to consumers buying some of the pork products that are out there now? And I notice you've got some here that have been labelled with freedom farmed, or that are people buying into that concept more? Yeah,
I think they are. I mean, consumers have said they want to know and they want the choice, and I think the industry is doing a really good job now of giving them that choice. So some people are continuing to buy what they've always bought, others are buying new products. I think we're bringing in new customers as well, and that's great.
Fantastic. Hayley, where does pork sit as a protein for consumers? Are welfare issues make it more challenging for it to be marketed, do you think?
Pork is still the leading meat consumed globally, so it's big. It's probably bigger than what we realise here in New Zealand. And although Rabobank's expectation is we will gradually see poultry probably start to overtake pork by 2020, the two of them really are the giants in the meat industry, and they'll continue to be so. And I think consumers really... they have grappled with both production systems, if you like, and in terms of increasing regulation around those production systems. But I think what we're talking about, though, is a very efficiently produced meat protein that's really valued, particularly in emerging markets, but also in really highly developed markets. And some of that consumer concern has actually created a lot of opportunities, because the various industries have been able to differentiate themselves much more than perhaps beef or sheep meat, where consumers are much more accepting perhaps of how they're produced. So in some respects it's provided opportunity in that regard.
How much do you think is around the fact that poultry and pork production is surrounded in mystique because it happens in sheds and in barns? It's not like out in paddocks where people can see what's going on. Is that an impact, do you think?
I think one of the things that New Zealanders assume they know about is sheep and beef production and dairy production, because we all drive through the country and we look over the fence, so we think we're pretty familiar with it. When it comes to pork and poultry, you're right, a lot of it is within sheds, and I think what have we got? We've got one pig farm for every 8,500 households in New Zealand, so the chances of anybody being on a pig farm are pretty remote. Again, the reason why we put things on the web, and we've got videos on the web that are accessible to people so they can know.
Now, the Minister for the Environment, Nick Smith, has reaffirmed the government's pledge to federated farmers that farming will not be included in the ETS if our trading partners don't follow suit. Hayley, is this good news, firstly, for our agriculture sector and for New Zealand as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's probably reasonably neutral in terms of it's still keeping that level playing field with our trade partners, which is obviously key from an agricultural sector point of view. But what it does mean is that there's still some degree of uncertainty there, and in some cases the uncertainty can be worse than knowing and being able to plan for that. I think the other thing for agriculture is that we still have end customers and end users that are insisting upon accounting for environmental emissions or other other sustainability issues. So that hasn't gone away. So it's not a relief from that point of view. I think one of the more important parts of the review and the report is perhaps the recommendation that the point of obligation should be at the farm level rather than the processor level. And depending on how that's handled, I think that probably has more implications going forward. But should also produce the behaviours that are required in terms of producers being rewarded for good practice and for lowering emissions or indeed providing a positive contribution.
Isn't that really the crux of the matter, though, that producers at this stage don't really know what positive actions they can take to be rewarded for it? Because some can argue that if you look at pastoral farming, it's probably one of the greatest creators of a carbon sink. And we're fantastic at that, and yet there's no recognition of that.
And that's why the point of obligation becomes really critical, because if it's at the processor level, then it's averaged, so there's no reward for good behaviour anyway. But you are right. I mean, there's still technologies needing to be to evolve and be adapted so that farmers can actually take some positive action and really look to mitigate those emissions.
Now, in another gesture supportive of the agriculture sector, the Minister for Agriculture has announced that the Irrigation Acceleration Fund is open for business. This fund has got $35 million over the next 5 years to promote irrigation schemes to the investment-ready stage. Do we need this fund?
It certainly helps in terms of being able to just initially kickstart some of that infrastructure investment. And I'm always intrigued by overseas visitors we have here who just can't believe how much water we let run out to sea. You know, that natural resource that is abundant and is pretty reliable in how it falls. It's just where it falls often isn't the most opportune. So I think, you know, in terms of kickstarting those initiatives, it probably does help in the long run just get those initiatives underway.
Who do you think are going to be the main beneficiaries of this fund? Is it going to be the producers, or will it be some intermediary who's going to set up the irrigation schemes?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was at a meeting with David Carter the other day where he was talking about the scheme, and the one thing that he said is that, listen, farmers often have the vision for what water could be used for, and I think if we look at one of the most limiting factors in New Zealand production is actually water, and particularly in summer in New Zealand. We've got a shrinking footprint of land available to us, so we do have the challenge of producing more, obviously responsibly. But David talked about the fact that he saw it was the ability of farmers to take the opportunity, get to where it was at an investment-ready stage, whereby outside investors could look at it with confidence and say, actually, this is something to get into. So it's probably around farmers, but also around intermediaries who are supporting them to get the scheme to, I guess, a bankable stage, you might call it.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Coming up after the break, pigs and cows are banned from Canterbury waterways. We ask what they've done to be so excluded. Rabobank's third quarter dairy review is out, and we ask Hayley for the highlights and the lowdowns for this sector. Outgoing Fonterra CEO is touted as a potential board member as John Ballard retires. Will this be a productive move or trying to lead from the grave? All this when we return. Welcome back to Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. Canterbury Regional Council bans pigs and cows from all waterways in an effort to clean up the region's water. Sam, how many pigs get access to waterways?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. If we look at pigs in New Zealand, I mean, a lot of them are indoors, right? Canterbury's a little bit unique in that about 40% of our sows are outdoors in New Zealand, and the majority of those are in Canterbury. But I'd be very surprised if any of them are accessing waterways. I mean, they do like to wallow, obviously, but well fenced, the piggeries, and so I think farmers would have that well under control. Nevertheless, we do recognise that you know, there are some environmental challenges out there, and one of the projects we're hoping to get funding from Sustainable Farming Fund this year is around looking at nutrients and outdoor piggeries. We're also just mainly through a project looking at best practice free-range farming as well. So, you know, we do have the obligation to be responsible, and that's the approach we're taking.
I just thought it was an unusual move, and I guess where they were coming from, it was the intensification of animals, and it was the animals that they identified were obviously cows and pigs. But I guess I wondered how they were going to police it, especially if you're mustering in, you know, cattle or sheep and they've got to cross a waterway. Isn't there more potential for, you know, effluent, for example, to enter a waterway when stock are crossing it and a large number from being mustered than the odd dairy cow going in for a swim? I mean, most people don't want their dairy cows swimming because of mastitis. I just kind of thought it was a bit of an unusual...
I think it depends on what approach they want to take. Do they want to take an outcome approach or an input approach? You know, farmers have the responsibility, and farmers understand, I think, their responsibilities well now, and the majority are working hard to meet them.
Hayley, Rabobank have just released their third quarter dairy outlook, which I believe you mostly wrote. So hopefully you can have a really good handle on it and you can tell us all about it.
Yeah, sure. Our global dairy team put it together, so I can't claim sole credit for that. But we'd always expected the outlook for quarter four was going to be a loosening up of the market anyway. I think the market's been anticipating a pretty good New Zealand season and Australian season for probably the last 6 months. And what's effectively happened is that with the turmoil in financial markets in Europe and the US, it's probably going to mean that weak demand in those markets sees more product spill out onto export markets, which will collide with what is usually our time of year in terms of our season picking up and more product volume. So for those reasons, we think that we'll see a slight softening in pricing over the coming quarter, but relatively limited, because what lower prices does is it enables buyers that have been priced out of the market to come back in. And in the dairy space, the market's pretty tight. So we see that list of buyers that are likely to come back in as being quite diverse, and probably quite a number of them that will limit the downside.
So going forward, like taking this quarter's results and projecting forward into the next season, what's the outlook for dairy? You know, certainly the conference that I attended earlier this year with the Australian group looking at this was that 2012 was going to be a pretty tight year for the dairy industry, but I haven't seen any evidence of that here. Is that something that's coming out in your report? Yeah,
certainly markets are still very tight. So there's not a lot of inventory around like there was after 2008.
Yeah.
And so that's still the underlying theme. So we really, at the moment, just viewing this as a quarter four issue in terms of this collision of export surplus. So going into 2012, we'd still expect prices to stay at pretty good levels, and probably some tightening just depending on how the New Zealand season pans out, really. Much hinges on that from a climatic point of view. The other potential upside is just how strong we see the likes of China and Russia returning to the market. They've been very strong in the last 12 months. And China typically buys alongside the New Zealand season, so there's a seasonal pattern there. But very definitely, you know, the outlook for prices is still to be pretty good, and probably currency is the biggest wild card there for 2012, is just what rates of conversion we see those good commodity prices coming back in New Zealand dollar terms.
And what's your feeling for that? Because like Greece is in crisis. They've just said that the EU and America, are potentially heading into another recession. Is that taken into account in your quarterly report, and what does that play out to be?
Yeah, absolutely, it's taken into account, and at this point it really is two different stories, because the emerging markets are still holding up very well, and of course they're our main destination for product. But with the Europeans and the Americans feeling pretty poor at the moment and under a lot of pressure, we'd expect that their demand and consumption will drop off, or probably certainly not grow. And because they're such big markets, even a small percentage point fall in consumption from those markets actually means a lot of dairy product coming onto world markets, and that's the biggest impact we see at the moment. We're not, and we can never rule out, you know, a repeat of 2008 in terms of if we start to see pressure on liquidity and on financial markets and that type of thing. And at the moment, we're not expecting that to repeat, but that's always a wild card risk that's in there as well.
Yeah. Sam, with the price of pork, what's happening with that, with the exchange rate? How much of our pork is actually exported versus on the local market?
Yeah, very, very small export market. So we're a domestic player, and what we're competing against is 700,000 kilos of imported pork coming in a week. So globally, what's happening is the pork price is going up, and that's a supply-demand relationship. And but because the exchange rate has been going up, they're sort of going in tandem, really. So imported pork's still pretty competitive coming into New Zealand.
And how are you getting on with your court case with PERS? Is that...
So the judge has reserved his judgment. Quite a complex case for him to get his head around. So we're not sure when we'll have a decision. Looking forward to it, obviously. Yes,
it'll be a big pressure off. Now, with the independent director for Fonterra standing down in John Ballard, it's been suggested that our outgoing CEO, Andrew Ferrier, will step up for election. Now, the cynic in me would suggest this is an orchestrated move. Anyone want to...
It's an interesting proposition because we've obviously seen it happen before with other companies where the chief executive has ended up on the board either in a relatively short space of time or thereafter. But I always find it interesting to see what would be in it for them from a personal challenge point of view. They've already run the company from a management point of view, and I'm just not quite sure what the attraction would be to now sit on the board as what would be an independent director. As far as I know, he wouldn't be standing as a shareholder director.
That's right. How fair do you think it is for the incoming CEO to have the outgoing CEO on the board? Is that...
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and I don't know the politics of the dairy industry. I mean, in terms of looking at the principle of a former CEO being on a board, I'm a CEO who reports to a board, but I also sit on 3 other boards as well. I think a CEO can bring quite unique qualities to a board. So you understand how a CEO thinks and what the feeling and the sort of needs and support that they have. You also know, I guess, where you can drill down into the business to really test the CEO. And I think you do have a really good appreciation of the difference between management and governance as well, which is very critical as a director. So I think a CEO can bring real strengths onto a board. The scenario of the CEO moving onto the board, well, it happens often enough, but that's a different scenario, I guess.
So, Hayley, you said that what's in it for Andrew Ferrier. What about the suggestion that Henry van der Hayden does not have a successor for chair? Do you think that's a potential for Andrew to step up into that space? And if not, what's going to happen to Fonterra when Sir Henry runs out of legs?
Yeah, it is an interesting question because he's been in the job for a long time and certainly made it his own. So I think there are some, there's a breadth of experience on the board in terms of farmer directors, but the Fonterra constitution effectively prohibits an independent director being the chairman or chairperson. So from that point of view, it really does need to be a farmer or shareholder director succession plan in place there. So I don't think you'd be able to tick the box in terms of it being a potential solution for that one. We'd still need to look within the farmer shareholder ranks for that.
Unless he wants to buy into a farm.
Absolutely.
You put your money where your mouth is, Andrew, and we can sell you a farm. That's about all we've got for this part of the show. We're going to come up after the break and ask Hayley and Sam what's got their goat, or in Sam's case, what's got his pig. Is it going to be a rant or will it be a rave? You join us after the break and find out. Welcome back to Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. It's time now for our weekly rant and rave. And it's ladies first, Hayley.
Thank you. I'll have a rave this week, and the thing that I'd like to rave about is really the smiles that I'm seeing on farmers' faces at the moment, and really a happier bunch I haven't seen for a wee while. And the thing that is more important about that to me is that we're actually seeing some more good old-fashioned competition between the different sectors happening at the moment, which we haven't seen for a long time. Partly, the sheep meat industry, meat and wool both providing pretty good returns, and I think for some of them now that are particularly efficient, they're providing the dairy guys with a run for their money in some parts of the country, and I just find that really encouraging, and I think it bodes well for our industry going forward, as that type of competition tends to result in productivity gains, more efficiencies on farm, and a bit of competition across the fence.
And a bit of mana too, a bit of pride in what you're doing. And
absolutely. So it's good to see that happen despite the other things that have been going against us in terms of, whether it be currency or some climatic events. But generally most of the country's in pretty good shape and looking forward to some pretty good returns over the coming season.
Sam?
Well, I want to have a rave this week as well. actually, and I want to congratulate those bacon makers in New Zealand who use New Zealand pork. We had our 100% New Zealand bacon competition recently, and congratulations to Ashby's Butchery in Christchurch, who are the supreme winners. You can go online and have a look at that. But the other interesting thing was a real compliment to the Christchurch operators. 4 of our finalists were actually Christchurch butchers. And so real credit to them. They've been through some pretty tough times, but they're certainly still producing a great standard of bacon.
Why do you think that is? What's so different and special about those guys down in Christchurch that are making their bacon so much better?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's because 60% of our pork production takes place in Canterbury, but I think what we're seeing is those that do a good job are consistently doing a good job. So we are seeing those people come through year after year after year. So I've got a little challenge though, and that's for the supermarkets, the Countdowns and the New Worlds. I want them to start using New Zealand pork in their own brands. So Pam's, Select and Countdown, let's see them using some New Zealand pork in there and really getting behind the New Zealand industry. You know, there's 700,000 kgs coming into New Zealand a week, and consumers have told us very clearly that they want New Zealand product. And in fact, consumers are getting behind us, which is really exciting. Our share of the retail market in terms of New Zealand branded bacons is increasing. And Mandy, I did make a promise to you that I was going to bring you some good bacon. So listen, I don't have this year's Ashby's winner, but listen, here's a couple of bacon. Hella's Middle Eye, which is the previous bacon of the year, and Kiwi's triple smoked. Both brilliant gold medal bacons. You can get them in every supermarket in New Zealand. So these are complimentary from the pork industry for you, Mandy, but I'd encourage all of those rural watchers out there to go and have a look for these in their local supermarket.
I'll definitely make sure my dogs aren't fighting over those. I won't be getting any scraps. They look great. Thanks, Sam. Now, I've got a rave. I want to talk about how great our country looks from the point of view of the Rugby World Cup. And I had the opportunity to do my bit for the country when a carload of Singaporeans turned up at my place looking for Hobbiton. Now, I'm at least 40 minutes from Hobbiton, so I'm a bit wary or concerned about how their GPS brought them exactly to my place. But credit to my contract milker on my farm. It was an absolute pleasure to take these guys around a real farm and to just show them what actually happens on a farm in New Zealand and how it can be just like we portray it. And I think that mustn't be an isolated incident. Everyone around the country is doing the same thing. And the country, I don't think, has ever looked better. It's been a great season, as you've said. The boys are playing well. I got to see the boys play in Hamilton against Japan. And I'll tell you one thing, I've never been in a stadium where there's 90,000 people who observed a minute's silence for both Canterbury and Japan. It was eerie. Absolutely eerie. And it was one of probably the things that I will cherish. And to see our homegrown boys out there doing it, no doubt, on New Zealand pork and bacon. You know, what else?
Pork is the leanest meat, you realise. Lean protein, very good for successful rugby players.
Well, there you go. So, you know, I just want to say that I'm really proud to be in New Zealand, and I'm actually really proud to be involved in the agriculture sector when we've got just so many people coming through and looking at who we are and what we do. And I think it's a real pleasure to go to the rugby and to see, like you say, so many happy people, and the atmosphere is amazing. But I do have to ask the question about this. You've heard of budgie smugglers? What was the French man thinking of when he tried to smuggle a rooster into the game in Hastings?
There's always one, isn't there, at these tournaments typically, in terms of getting the country mascot in. But in terms of the regional games, I have to agree with you, the support from the regions has been fantastic, despite obviously what some supporters are trying to get into games. And I think that's been uplifting as well, to see the smaller games, the regional centres, you know, very full stadiums and grounds, and people out there supporting a team. It's great to see.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
I think actually the bigger question around that rooster was whether it was imported from France and it got through the border. I mean, that's a question we really need to be asking now.
I'll be sure to put that back through and make sure we get some DNA testing off the chicken feathers, and I'm sure they can come to the pork industry to work out how to fight that battle in court. That wraps up our latest edition of Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Furrow. And I'd like to thank my guests, Hayley, Moynihan and Sam McIvor. And thanks to you too for watching. Remember to check out my blog online at country99tv.co.nz. I love hearing from you. We'll catch you next week. And in the meantime, may the pig of happiness keep smiling upon you.